So, Gregory Shushan, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that a lot of people have asked for. I've listened to so many of your lectures now, which have been, becoming really popular. People have been sending them to me, in the past. So I was really excited about this. So we're discussing really near-death experiences and, doing a bit more research and just covering all the bases. Before the discussion, I noticed you're sort of renowned as basically the number one authority, it seems, on near-death experiences, and you've written Conceptions of the Afterlife in Early Civilizations and Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, and I believe, is that your latest book, or there's one soon to be released?
Yeah, there's one that's going to be released either later this month or maybe early next month, and that's called The Next World, with the subtitle Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife.
Okay.
I should back up, though, but just... I'm honored that you say that about my stature. I would say, at best, I'm the main person for cross-cultural and historical near-death experiences. But from the scientific stuff, there's that's a whole different ball game. There's people like Bruce Grayson and Kenneth Ring, and yeah.
Okay. So that's been your sort of your major focus. I mean, was there, for those that don't know you, I mean, was there something before your research into near-death experiences which you were into, you were researching, and then there's always this story of like you came across the one book and then you went into near-death experiences. Was there anything like that, or have you just always been interested?
No, it was a bit like that. Yeah. I mean, this is not my sort of original field of study. I started out in Eastern Mediterranean archaeology and then progressed from there to Egyptian archaeology. But I did, even before I was studying it all, in the sort of mid-'80s, my mom had a book by Carol Zaleski called Otherworld Journeys. And that was a comparison. She's a theologian, and she did a historical comparison between near-death experiences and medieval visions of the afterlife. So that kind of stuck in my head. And at the time, because I was just kind of interested in like, wow, that's trippy. It's like... somebody found this kind of parallels, and it sort of seems to validate NDEs. I didn't really delve into the book. I just kind of, familiarized myself with the general idea. So then later I was studying, when I was doing Egyptology in London, you have to read books of the dead and different kinds of Egyptian texts. And so I was looking at descriptions of the afterlife and started noticing that there were parallels to NDEs, so in a very general way. So, the deceased is described in these texts as leaving the body, entering darkness, coming out into light, meeting a being of light in the form of the Egyptian sun god Re, and then that sun god sort of assists in this life review process. There's this sort of judgment of the good and bad deeds, and a sort of reckoning of the soul, I guess is the way to put it, or the weighing of the heart, as you see in papyrus. Papyri, they would weigh the heart against the feather of Ma'at, and Ma'at is like the principle of justice and all things that are correct in the world. And then there's another really interesting description in those texts where the soul of the dead is identified with the god Osiris, who's the god of the underworld, and he's depicted as often in green because he's a corpse. And there's a passage where the soul encounters this corpse of Osiris in this particular region of the underworld, and it's described as the efflux of Osiris, which basically means it's the putrefying corpse, and it's the witnessing of that enables the soul to progress further in the afterlife. And I see that as a parallel of the person who has a near-death experience leaving their body and seeing their body lying there below. And then that's what makes them realize that they're dead, but they've actually survived their own death in a disembodied consciousness. And it's actually presented in that way in the pyramid texts and coffin texts, that essentially this realization is what the realization that you are Osiris, that you're dead, and that you've survived your own death is the thing that is enables you to continue and join the sun god in the circuit in the celestial world and the underworld. So
originally, when you came across this text, I hope you don't mind me asking, did you have a religious foundation yourself, a personal religious foundation?
No. I grew up a sort of I don't know. I guess the best way to put it is like a passive atheist. Both my mother was a ex-Catholic who, as many ex-Catholics are quite hostile to to their upbringing and to the church. My father was Jewish and completely unconcerned with anything to do with religion or theology. I was exposed to different kinds of religions growing up because the older generations of both sides of my family, we'd go to some Catholic wedding or cousin's bar mitzvah or whatever. And then my mom was, she was interested in mysticism and psychedelics. She's of that generation. So, she would take me to the Hare Krishna temple when I was, 5 years old to go chanting. And so I just had a lot of exposure, but I didn't have any belief. And it was almost like the same as going to Disneyland for me. It was like this suspension of disbelief and kind of pretend like I would believe these things just to try it out, So, yeah.
I mean, I think that's a good approach, especially within what you're sort of studying. But before we do get too deep into NDEs, near-death experiences, I do have to ask you the Hermitix question, which I now sort of notice that in terms of what you're studying, this question is completely different for you because you can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen into the conversation. Who do you pick? But obviously,
Right.
Usually when I ask this, the fact that they're living or dead doesn't particularly matter because they just want to speak to them. But of course, for yourself, it may very much matter that they've died.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, I would. My first impulse is to choose people from totally different realms, whose work I respect in very different but equally profound ways. So, Joseph Conrad, because he was just such a brilliant writer and such an incisive, perceptive thinker. And maybe Frederick Myers, who was the founder of the Society for Psychical Research, but was also a classicist. And then maybe George Harrison, just because it would be an interesting mix. And he had a very kind of profound spiritual vision, but from a totally untrained, non-academic, non-literary sort of way.
Okay, so you'd want that room to be really the most sort of varied, open discussion possible.
Yeah, and I think partly because another one might be H.H. Price, who was an Oxford philosopher who wrote a lot about the afterlife. But I guess it also depends on if we were talking specifically about NDEs and afterlife and religious experience. It would probably look different than if it was just general conversation. I also might throw in E.R. Dodds, who was another classical scholar who had an interest in the paranormal, and he was much more skeptical than somebody like Frederick Myers. So for this world, I would say Myers, Price, and Dodds would probably be my three.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that conversation would possibly vector into a discussion of the afterlife?
Definitely, yeah. And then, it also depends. This is where we kind of get into the issues with survival of the afterlife and mediumship texts and all this stuff, because there are loads of texts that are supposedly Frederick Myers speaking through mediums from the other world. So it depends on if it would be that version of Myers or the version of Myers who was on Earth.
I mean, have you found a difficulty? I mean, this is a difficulty I find myself in trying to do podcasts on this forgotten stuff. Is there's a very fine line between I need to be somewhat polite, but something which is rigorous in its study of mediumship, of the afterlife, of other worlds, of the paranormal, and the very fine line between that and someone who may very well have lost their mind, or it may just not be rigorous, or you may just think, okay, like you might need some help. And I don't mean that in a horrible way. Have you found a difficulty in finding, because at the same time, you don't want to academize everything in the sense of it becoming this sort of like footnoted, thing where it becomes
Yeah.
I don't know, a piece of literature or something like that. So have you found that a difficulty, especially I guess in writing books and doing this through the academy? Have you found that a difficult thing to discern where those two sides are?
Sometimes, yeah. I would say mostly with the mediumship stuff. But because, I consider myself really a historian of religions, then I can, and that brings in sociology and anthropology and all sorts of other disciplines. I can look at this stuff and academize it, as you said, from that perspective, without giving it necessarily the kind of, treating it as a serious, rigorous kind of work. So, but with mediumship stuff, with my new book, The Next World, I look at that because I was thinking mostly 19th and early 20th century mediumship accounts from the Society of Psychical Research, researched by quite good scholars like Myers or scientist Frederick Lodge. What's his name? Oliver Lodge. Sorry, and a lot of these people who were of their time, respected mainstream scientists who just happened to have this interest in an afterlife. So I wanted to look at descriptions of the afterlife from those texts, ostensibly communicated by spirits who live there through mediums who are being researched by these scholars and scientists. Because I thought, if there are similarities between near-death experiences across cultures, then that needs to be addressed regardless of whether the mediumship accounts are true or not. So the approach I took to that was to look at mediums who had the best reputation for giving the most evidential evidence, the ones who convinced these scientists and scholars more than anyone else. So William James was another one who was very much compelled that there was something paranormal going on, or supernatural, however you want to put it. He wasn't totally convinced that it was mediumship, that they were really channeling people who were in the afterlife, but he was convinced that they were obtaining information in means that were not normal, super telepathy or whatever. So the problem there was the descriptions of the afterlife never occurred during sittings that were supposedly giving evidential material. So, for example, there are these famous cross correspondences where different mediums would give different bits of a particular piece of knowledge that the sitters didn't know anything about, and then it would turn out to be true once they were all put together. So sometimes there were things like book tests where the spirit from the other world would supposedly tell the medium, you're going to find the answer to this question on this particular book, on this page, and it's located in this library, and they would go there and they would find it. So those are interesting accounts, they're and they convince the scientists of their days and all that. But when the descriptions of the afterlife are not in those kinds of contexts, they're being transmitted at other times, then you kind of wonder, was that considered an evidential sitting, and how serious am I supposed to take it? And then once you actually read the descriptions, then that is a whole additional layer of skepticism and doubt and caution in the way these texts are approached, because they're full of, they're basically, a sort of Edwardian or Victorian version of an idealized afterlife that's designed to preserve the status quo of society. And they literally describe, the lowest level is the England that we're in. The next level is a slightly rarefied one. And there's 7 levels of Englands all piled on top of each other. There's racial segregation, social segregation. And in fact, servants are described as not being emancipated enough to even want to be freedom. I'm sorry, they're not to even want to be free. They don't even think that way. They're happy to continue to serve their owners or their employers. So there is still slavery in the afterlife, and there's still classism and racism and all this stuff. So so that raises the other question of, like, if these are supposedly genuine descriptions of the afterlife, how do we square that with claims that people become enlightened when they die, and that they become this kind of almost divine being, where they've everything is good and positive, and there's no negative morality or negative behavior.
Has there been any clear historical cases of where such an experience, someone said, okay, we had this experience, and their version of the afterlife or whatever it was they experienced is completely, anathema to the social standard of the day? So you mentioned, the context of slavery. It's like, okay, in the afterlife, by the way, there's still slavery. Like, guess what? Everything that you currently agree with as a social cohesion is still there. You're all right.
Right.
You got it right. Is there anywhere, someone's come back and then they've said, oh, like, it's real different there?
From the mediumship, no, not really. And it's interesting too, because you look at more modern mediumship accounts from John Edwards or Gordon Smith, these kind of more recent people, and the afterlife they describe it's racially inclusive, and it's a realm of continued learning and education, and you you're enlightened and progressive, and it's a very different kind of thing. And I should say too, the slavery thing, that was a specifically American thing. In the UK, it was servants were okay, but they didn't really sanction slavery. But they did say, there is segregation, but it's voluntary because everybody wants to be among their own people.
Okay. Well, that's a way to square it, I guess. I mean, so it seems that are the majority of these reports anthropocentric in this manner, that the afterlife is this humanized place where it's really basically what we're living now, but perfect, which to me seems unsquarable with eternity, right? However good it can be now, it's like, yeah, things can be great, but not for like eternity is a long time. So is there any which really drastically differ? And they say, look, it wasn't even human.
No, getting from the mediumship stuff again. No, I'm from near-death experiences. Yeah, NDEs are a lot more diverse across cultures and even between individuals. But yeah, the mediumship stuff seems to be very much reflecting the current beliefs and ideals of the time. And a lot of these people were considered progressive at the time, and eugenics wasn't considered necessarily a horrible thing. There was kind of a progressive thing, and the same people talking about that are actually promoting free love and being open-minded about homosexuality, and so it's a really, really different and interesting time.
Mm-hmm. So you're as a historian, your work now is obviously spanning thousands of years, from early civilizations and indigenous religions all through to now the mediumship. So this whole span, across this whole span of time, have you begun to sort of notice categories which certain things fall into completely across time, so that maybe they're not exactly the same experiences, but they fall into a certain category of understanding of what a death experience or the afterlife is like?
Yeah, near-death experiences definitely. I said they're really diverse between individuals and across cultures, but there's still, just the basic context of them, for one thing, makes them similar. So somebody is either temporarily dead, biologically, medically, or they appear to be, or they think they are, but they're somehow physically compromised into a state that seems to be death. And they come back from that and they report experiences that they had while they were unconscious. So even just that very basic thing, never mind what they claim to have experienced while they were out of their body, but even just that as a stable thing that has been reported throughout pretty much all of history, in societies of all kinds, from ancient civilizations to the smallest tribal groups in Pacific Islands or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So from my reading, it sort of seemed that people who have these experiences, their general experience stays within the bounds of the religious context that they're within. I'm really intrigued as to whether or not someone's had, or there's reports of a near-death experience where someone from, let's say, X religion has an experience which is of Y spirituality. Something where they go, okay, I got it wrong.
Yeah. Yes and no, because for the no, there are no examples that I know of where, for example, somebody who had never heard of Jesus in medieval Japan had an NDE of Jesus, or somebody in medieval France had one of the Buddha or whatever, where they encountered a being of light, or very culturally specific figures or ideas that were totally alien to their own religion. So that just pretty much doesn't happen. But what does happen sometimes, or quite often really, is that the experience will challenge their pre-existing beliefs in various ways. So, for example, in some of the Native American accounts, once they were introduced to Christianity, they would have NDEs involving Jesus, and sometimes they would interpret that as a message of conversion, and they would come back from their NDE and want to convert their tribe, and they would start a new religious movement with new rituals and whatever. Which in its you got a blackout.
Yeah, worrying.
Which in itself is interesting because it shows just that one little example shows how NDEs can influence and impact people's afterlife beliefs, as well as their religious beliefs related to those afterlife, the religious practices. So, but on other occasions, they would have an NDE and come back and say, we have to fight against the white man, these invading Europeans. We don't believe in this Jesus figure. Their version of hell and the afterlife is ridiculous. So yeah, it can kind of go either way. And then there's other examples where they came back with a message saying, not just Native Americans, but all different cultures. For example, we need to stop. I went to the underworld and I spoke to the dead or to a divine being there, and they said we need to stop giving funerary offerings to the dead, and because it's wasteful and it's a waste of our resources, and they don't really need it because they're in a spiritual form. Or any other kind of instruction or restriction. For example, stopping wife beating was another one that I came across. So whether those are beliefs, that it's a religious belief that it's okay to beat your wife, and then you're told that it's not afterwards, that's probably not a religious thing, but it's a moral realization in the other world that it's not something that you should continue doing.
Perhaps I'm heading too far into the sort of the relativization of these things, which I myself personally dislike, and I've got a few questions about that. But I mean, I'm going to assume that this is immediately a position that many psychologists might take, which is almost, you could call it like the Jungian analysis, which would be that in this states of near death, it's almost like an extremely intense dream where, in relation to this wife beating thing, it's like an extremely deep subconscious reaction to something that they know is that they should be doing but don't want to admit to, sort of a latent, I apologize for these blackouts, a latent admittance for something, that suddenly comes to the surface. I mean, is this something which is, I imagine it is often projected onto these experiences, that it's a psychological process?
Yeah, and I think there probably is something to that. Not in the sense that explains near-death experiences fully, but my personal take on it is that these experiences are a combination of psychological, biological, possibly genuinely spiritual. We don't know, but we can't. Just because you're in a compromised situation, and even if you're out of your body, if we want to just accept that, just for argument's sake, for the moment. It doesn't mean that you're no longer you and that you don't have your memories anymore and your issues and hang-ups and whatever, your fears, your desires. So all that, I think, is going to impact the experience, but I don't think that they create it. So I think it's I think there is a subjective, genuine, or an objective, actual, genuine experience that happens, but I think it's not really clothed or given form until your own psyche does that for you, basically.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, it does beg the question: what are you without a body? Yeah. Have you found any way to perhaps begin to address this question?
No, that's that kind of. That's one of those fortunate things I can just say, well, no, I'm a historian, I don't have to do that. But I have looked at some of it, like I mentioned H.H. Price earlier, and he has a very interesting model survival after death, which actually reflects Mahayana Buddhism and various other beliefs in different cultures. That and it kind of helps to explain NDEs, that it's a sort of like a lucid dream afterlife, basically, that you've survived consciousness. I'm sorry, your consciousness has survived death, and it's essentially creating the environment, but it's co-creating it together with the spirits of other dead people. And the reason I think that's kind of an appealing idea, if you wanted to have a model for an afterlife, is precisely because it addresses the cross-cultural and the individual differences, but it also embraces the similarities. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, wow, that sort of is almost like, not to get too densely philosophical, but it's like a pure idealism, right? So these multiple consciousnesses which aren't embodied collectively create something. So it's like I can't really explain that, but it seems like almost like a post-Kantian type thing going on.
Yeah. So I mean, I think so. If you think about lucid dreaming, which is just you're dreaming and you become conscious within the dream, and you feel like you're awake, and you just know you're dreaming, but it doesn't necessarily change the dream. Some people can do that. If you practice, you can kind of manipulate the whole dream reality. And it's funny because this lucid dreaming was something that 40 years ago or whatever was considered this woo-woo new age thing that, and scientists would say there is no lucid dreaming. You're dreaming that you're conscious during the dream. It's not possible. But now I think it's widely accepted that you actually can be conscious in a dream. So if we extrapolate from that, when you become awake in your dream, the sort of dream environment, the town or the house or wherever you are, it doesn't suddenly disappear and you're left with a blank slate. It's still there. So some part of your subconscious is still creating the setting or the backdrop for the dream. So if you're disembodied and you're doing that with other people, and everyone is kind of creating this backdrop, but then you're also creating your own elements, it makes a weird kind of sense to me. Or even, the sort of alternative to that, which also makes an equally weird sense, is that these things in the other world are actually objective, but you're just projecting the clothing onto them, or the imagery that gives them form, which again would explain differences in NDEs. So, for example, if you go to the spirit village, as they might call it in an indigenous society, and for some people it's going to be teepees and a ghost dance circle, and there's going to be cactus or whatever. And some people it's going to be, a small English village with thatched cottages. So, but they might be the exact same building, just perceived in different ways by different people.
Okay, that makes sense. I used to lucid dream. I don't do it anymore because I don't like what happens with time in these experiences. And I got trapped in a lucid dream for a long time, which felt like a month. And then I woke up and it was a really horrible experience. So I just don't do it anymore.
Yeah, I was getting headaches from it, so that's why I stopped doing it. But every once in a while it happens spontaneously, which is always weird. Yeah,
no, it happens spontaneously, but I feel if you play around with them, it's not something you should play around with too much. That's the impression I got anyway. But it was a very strange thing. So, I mean, the amazing thing with regards to your sort of, I guess, all of your scholarship is that these aren't new or old phenomena. This is. I mean, could we say since history recorded, practically speaking, there has been such experiences?
Yeah, and if not, even if they weren't genuine, factual, documentary accounts, it seems that knowledge of these experiences have been known since the very earliest texts. I mean, one of the earliest is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's an earlier version of that's the Sumerian version, where he's called Gilgamesh, which was his Sumerian name. And there's a text called the Death of Gilgamesh, and it describes essentially him having an NDE where he dies and then he goes and appears before beings of light in another world, and they assist him in a process of reviewing his life's deeds, and then he becomes a sort of divine figure. And then he returns to his body and then prepares his funeral and so on. So they believe, archaeologists and historians believe there really was this figure of Gilgamesh, that he was a genuine king. Whether that account is just a mythologized near-death experience, that to me that seems pretty likely. At minimum, it seems to suggest that they were familiar with near-death experiences having happened and attributed one to Gilgamesh. So, and that's a different kind of scenario than, say, in Egypt, where there weren't any NDE type accounts until there's a few myths in much later periods, which might reflect NDEs. But earlier, it's just these descriptions of in these afterlife guidebooks like the Book of the Dead and Hermitix that just happen to reflect NDEs, and so that was that's a little more speculative on my part when there's no evidence that they knew about NDEs like there probably is from ancient Sumer. It's more like nevertheless their afterlife beliefs seem to reflect knowledge of the phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So considering that they've been through history this whole time, has there ever been a sort of a collective scientific effort to sort of cross-correlate them and try objectively work out what's going on and almost use them as a resource to try do the typical scientific thing and say, look, we'll get them all together and try figure out what's going to happen when we die?
Not yet. I mean, that's basically what I've been doing. There have been a few people looking at cross-cultural NDEs before me. I mean, even William Namoudi in Life After Life, he mentioned a couple. He mentioned the myth of Ur from ancient Greece. Mostly it's been two other scholars, sociologist James McLennan, who wrote on Congo NDEs, and he compared medieval Chinese and Japanese accounts with NDEs. And also Alan Kelly here, he looked at some small-scale societies. He found one from Hawaii and a couple others. But there were very, very few at the time that they were doing their research. So I've been trying to just gather more and more and more as time goes on in order to develop this corpus, because it just didn't exist before. For a long time, people just thought it was a modern Western phenomena. And part of the point of Kelly here and McLennan's work was to show, like, actually it isn't, and here's some examples. And so there was a debate about that for a while. And actually in some circles there probably still is. I applied for a grant a few years ago, and I didn't get it, and so I asked to see the reviewers' comments. And one of them, his entire assessment of my project was, the entire project is grounded in nonsense. So people are going to be denying this stuff maybe until I get them out there on a more kind of mainstream level, because I just don't see how you can read, hundreds of accounts from around the world throughout history and say, no, it's all in the brain, or it's culturally generated, because culture is not the same all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Have you felt that much pushback generally, or is that sort of a bit of an anomaly?
No, there is pushback. I mean, there have been debates and I don't know, it's kind of dismissive attitudes pretty often. Depending on, I've kind of stopped doing, regular academic conferences now, mainstream kind of stuff, because of that reason. Because I'll go through a whole presentation of my work. I did one in Germany where it was on ancient Near Eastern afterlife, and I thought, okay, here's a great place to kind of introduce these ideas. I compared Sumerian and ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs and said, okay, here are the elements they have in common. What might explain that? How about an NDE? Because here are the elements that are reflected exactly, precisely in those texts. I kind of methodically went through it, and the first question was, it's all a bit New Age, isn't it? It's just like, actually, no, it's not. So, yeah, that was difficult. And then just in religious studies in general, there's this disciplinary division between religious studies and theology, which is understandable and justifiable. They have to distinguish themselves from as a secular discipline as opposed to a religious discipline. I guess I should just clarify, theology is essentially people within their own religion, studying their own religion, often seeking to justify the beliefs of their religion. I guess it can be done by people who are outside that religion, but it's still it's an apologetic exercise to bolster particular religious beliefs, and also trying to find, spiritual and religious truths with a capital T. Whereas religious studies is really sort of a combination of anthropology and sociology, and it's a very secular position of studying the other. And even if you are religious, you set that aside and you don't place value judgments. You don't even try to make claims about whether another religion's beliefs are true, whether their deities exist or anything like that. So it's it's much more of an anthropological, sociological exercise.
And it's I guess it's sort of frustrating because, I remember one of the first near-death experiences that I read about, which made me, back when I was sort of as you described it, a passive atheist many years ago, which made me come round to something more, was from, I think it's A.J. Ayer, who, this sort of diehard analytic atheist, and then all of a sudden has this extremely, and it's not sort of a general near-death experience, it's a peculiar one of him describing meeting two beings who have had a sort of catastrophe in the cosmos. And I remember thinking, of all the people who wouldn't want to admit to such a thing, here's someone who really wouldn't. And it's a peculiar instance, and I think it brought me around to it. But I can imagine your frustration at the idea of it's all New Age.
There's another one, actually, an atheist, John Wren Lewis, who was a philosopher who was, he thought that all of this kind of stuff was like pathology, basically. Anything, mysticism, religious beliefs were basically pathological. And then he had an NDE, and it was also atypical. I don't even know if we can speak of typical anyway when it comes to NDE, beyond the kind of stereotypical popular image of it. But he came back and said, actually, the perennial philosophers were right. Aldous Huxley was right. There is a single cosmos. It's all expressions of the same divine, and all this kind of stuff. So that's a really interesting. Just going back to earlier when you asked about it changing people's religious beliefs, it also changes atheist beliefs into actually believing in an afterlife, and it changes. Evangelical Christians or whatever might go and come back and say, actually, there is a God and there's a spiritual realm, but all that other stuff is not true. I'm not going to be an evangelical anymore.
Has it changed your beliefs?
I don't know that I would say that it has. It's maybe it's got me to the point where I can see philosophical rationality or reasonableness of belief in an afterlife. Also realizing that belief in an afterlife is not necessarily entangled with belief in a God or divine beings of any kind. Like, I think you can very reasonably believe in an afterlife without believing in a God. That's a little easier for me because I guess because I grew up as an atheist, it's an extra step I'm not quite willing to take. And I've also, the more I've looked at, I'm not a specialist in the scientific elements of all this, but I've had to look at it in some depth. And what I do know is that there hasn't been a single materialist scientific explanation for NDEs that works, that holds up. They're all dependent on either the brain being dying, which doesn't work because sometimes NDEs happen when the brain isn't dying, when the person just thinks they're dead, or they're dependent on, biological, physiological things like lack of oxygen or too much oxygen or too much carbon dioxide or whatever, or anesthetics, and none of these things apply across the board. So they just can't explain NDEs, and so there just hasn't been. Every once in a while there'll be something. In Psychology Today or some popular magazine or online source that says scientists now know that NDEs are all in the brain. it's always the same thing, and it's never persuasive.
I remember seeing recently an article by Brian Cox saying science has disproved the soul, and I thought, okay, good for you, science.
Yeah.
Do you feel that secular bias is somewhat harmful to your studies, because it's immediately beginning from a foundation which doesn't really at least sympathize with them and allow us to really open them up?
Yeah, I think it does. And the ironic thing is, I mentioned I came from archaeology. I did my MA was the first part of my first book, which was comparing Egyptian afterlife beliefs with ancient Indian Vedic beliefs to near-death experiences, and this was embraced with open arms, and at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, and I got funding for it, and it was great. And then I got into religious studies, and suddenly met all this criticism and dismissiveness and resistance. Not at Lampeter. I mean, I was at Lampeter where I did my PhD, and it was a very welcoming. It was a great place to do it. But when you get outside the Lampeter bubble, and you're encountering people like the British Association for Study of Religion or American Academy of Religion, there's this diehard postmodernist denialism of anything that has to do, that anything that could indicate spirituality. And it's understandable because they need to, like I said, distinguish themselves from theology. And that's one way of doing it. But they threw the baby out with the bathwater. They're so threatened by this that, so for example, it's actually not even called religious studies anymore. It's called the study of religions. Before religious studies, it was called comparative religion. Mm-hmm. And the reason that changed is because it's no longer okay to compare, because by comparing, you're supposedly denying individuality and uniqueness to the cultures that you're comparing. And that's a colonialist sort of attitude, supposedly.
Okay.
And so it's further domination of these cultures. The argument goes, and in some ways it's understandable, because it's true that in the past, 19th century up to maybe the 60s, comparative religion often was comparing my superior religion to those of the heathen, and finding some similarities, and therefore saying things like, that's because they were on the path to the one true God, and they didn't quite get there, but they're these poor souls that we must save, or whatever. Or it was a diffusionist kind of explanation, where our wonderful religion obviously spread throughout the world and influenced all these people, and that's why these things are similar. So there was this denial of uniqueness and denial of individuality, and there has been a tendency to see religions as all being the same, or all as one. This, and there are people like Jung, as you mentioned, and Monsieur Eliade, and Joseph Campbell, Fraser, who kind of encouraged this line of thinking. So yeah, the reaction from religious studies, or the study of religions, was to no longer compare, essentially. I mean, people have still done it here and there, but it's you have to justify your comparison. You have to justify everything in academic work, but comparison, it's like you have to bend over backwards to explain why and how you're doing it. And there are even people, Wendy Doniger at Chicago, she's a wonderful scholar of Hinduism. She was one of the first people who was like pushing back and saying, actually, maybe we should compare. But she said we should only compare differences. We should only look at the differences when we compare. We shouldn't look at the similarities. Mm-hmm. And from my way of thinking, I think part of the reason for this, part of this backlash, is if there is something that's genuinely similar across cultures and people are interpreting it in religious terms, then that kind of justifies not only comparison, but it starts making us think maybe there is some particular common ground for religious beliefs. And so in my work, that's near-death experiences. so just to leaving aside the comparison similarity thing for a minute, there's a particular hostility towards the idea of religious experience in contemporary study of religions, because if you say that there is a type of experience that people have cross-culturally that leads to similar kinds of beliefs, that negates the whole idea that all experience is culturally generated and totally culturally unique. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem with that, I think what upsets people so much, this kind of postmodernist type thinking, is that just that it undermines the entire foundation that way of thinking is built upon. It's like there's this whole series of axioms that they rely on, that none of them are proven, but they need them in order to stick with this. There's no cross-cultural comparability. There's no such thing as experience. All experience is culturally generated. So.
But it's quite ironic, because in doing so, they sort of almost bring back, as postmodernism is understood as sort of the critique of overarching meta-narratives, right? They sort of bring back meta-narratives by saying, well, we can't connect these all into one big meta-narrative, a perennial narrative, so we need to condense them back to their singular ones, which then brings back sort of hegemonic singular cultures, which is in itself another strange thing. But it's also, I guess, they then keep deconstructing. And so, that would be the question. What happens when you do begin to just, you draw a line around and say, look, none of these are connected. That's that culture. What damage does that do to those cultures? Or what damage, I guess, does that do to the study?
Well, it's, for one thing, it's just unreasonably and needlessly cutting off a whole area of human experience and a whole sort of method of looking at different human groups. I just think that the idea of it's almost a sort of fanatical belief, like, oh well, don't look at it because it might be true. So don't tell me that there's such a thing as near-death experience across cultures, because there isn't. That is basically the essential attitude. And at conferences, I've been confronted at the end by postmodernist types saying, why do you call them near-death experiences when they're not all the same experience across culture, for example? And the answer is, well, they believe that they died. There was a period of unconsciousness. They came back and they told of what happened in the interim. And that's it, So what they actually said during that time, we can compare that in various different ways. But no, I think it's just it's an example of shooting themselves in the foot in order to basically privilege their philosophical preconceptions, because there's actually no evidence that belief must precede experience. And in fact, in near-death experiences, there are people who don't believe them who nevertheless have them. There's people who have unexpected things during the experience. They might not meet the relative or the deity or whoever that they would expect. So it just goes against everything that they're trying to promote. And part of it might be that they're wanting to preserve that distinction between theology so they can keep their jobs, basically. Mm-hmm. They don't want to think themselves out of a discipline or out of a field.
Well, that's pretty much the postmodernist whole thing, right? Is trying to keep their job. They critique most things, but they don't critique the education system which pays them. So that's why I was
exactly. And they also don't interrogate their own philosophical assumptions. So there's I wrote an article. In fact, this discussion is going to be in my new book as well, in the next world. There's this attitude that there's a scholar named Robert Scharf at Berkeley. There's another one, Brian Bocking, who used to be at Cork. These are excellent scholars when it comes to Buddhism or Shintoism or whatever their particular area of study is. A lot of these people, but when it comes to this stuff, it's almost mind-boggling, because Scharf says things like, we are not obliged to accept accounts of experiences as descriptions of actual experiences. We're not obliged to. And then he says, there's no reason for us to accept them as genuine accounts of experiences. And to me, that's that's far more damaging than seeing cross-cultural similarity, because that's saying our sources are untrustworthy. Most of the time, our sources are not in our own culture. If you're a scholar of another religion or another culture, so then we're judging people in other cultures and essentially telling them that they're deluded or that they're lying, and also that any comparable account in any other culture is not actually comparable because they were culturally generated. So I mean, it makes no sense, and it breaks down. And it was interesting because I wrote an article for Method and Theory in the Study of Religions, which is you can tell by the title of the journal, it's not a fun, playful journal. It's a very academically heavy journal. And this article, which is about this whole debate, they contacted 4 or 5 people that I had critiqued, and it was supposed to be a symposium issue. And each of these scholars was going to write replies and defenses and justifications and explanations if I got something wrong, which I'm willing to keep an open mind about. And then I was going to write replies, and all of them backed out once they saw my article, which is it's telling, I think, because I don't know if they. Well, it's telling in one way or another. I mean, either they read it and they thought, okay, I'm busted, I don't have anything to reply to this, or they just thought this guy is so off base that he doesn't deserve a reply. But in the 10 years since I first wrote this article, nobody has been able to explain to me why I'm wrong, or people have said, oh well, so-and-so scholar you discussed, Sharf or whoever, he doesn't really mean that. That's not really what he said. You got it wrong. It's like, okay, explain to me how, because this is precisely what he wrote. So, and I'm still open to if anyone wants to challenge me on it, but it's been a while now. So,
well, I guess it's one of the reasons to sever that link between cultures and say all these cultures are singular, is then you can say there was a big gap. And that culture, they used to do these really archaic things. We're not like them. We're not savages, and we don't do this weird stuff. But in the same time, those experiences basically they're no longer actually experiences as we're talking about them. They're subsumed into our framework of deconstruction of materialism, of secularism, right? So there's no gods. We know there's no gods. We know everything's material. So then their experience is no longer taken in their own terms, which really basically means that you're no longer studying the same thing. And it almost seems that at the same time that's sort of bad, I guess in a way, bad archaeology. I don't know all that much about archaeology, but it's the same methodology as bad science, right? Saying, oh, that new research that you found doesn't fit the science, which all works, so we're just going to ignore it because we need this to keep working, and that the whole point of science is to say, oh, you guys have been studying X, well, we actually just found something which disproves it, is to go, oh, okay, well, we'll look into that, instead of going, oh, it doesn't fit, that means it's wrong, which seems to be what's happening.
Yeah, in religious study, in the study of religions, yeah. And yeah, in archaeology, I guess in archaeology it was assumed that you're not going to go there, that you're not going to have a mystical or spiritual interpretation of the NDEs, and that I was just looking at them as whatever they are, it's a phenomenon that happens. So that was accepted. But in study of religions, that's where the resistance comes in, and I think it's because again, if there is a cross-cultural type of experience that generates religious beliefs, then that's a completely that undermines the whole structure. And there's a term that they use, crypto-theology, or they accuse you of being a crypto-theologian, that you're smuggling spiritual beliefs into the secular study of religion. Rather than, and that's even when I would say, no, I'm not saying that NDEs are genuine spiritual experiences. I'm saying they're experiences that people interpret in spiritual ways across cultures. But that's not enough either.
And I mean, and it is also sort of extremely arrogant and hegemonic in a certain sense in relation to predominant religions, because the let's say the major world religions most definitely has experiences within the scripture and within the tradition which would be considered otherworldly, divine, or near death. But then they say, well, of course ours are true, but not but not everyone else. That you're saying, well, actually within their own culture they did have these experiences. So it's a bit heavy-handed.
Well, theologians might say that, but secular study of religions people would say none of it's true. So, or maybe the more open-minded ones might say, we don't discuss whether they're true or not. That's a more honest study of religion's answer. But they go beyond it. They actually say, and this goes back to, they're not interrogating themselves, the postmodernist study of religions people. They're actually making a truth judgment and a value judgment about these experiences and saying, they're not just saying they're not mystical, they're not genuinely supernatural, they're saying they didn't happen. And these people they can't tell that they didn't happen because they're so enculturated that they can't tell the difference between, a genuine experience and just a cultural experience. So
despite all their efforts to decolonize the postmodern academy, they've basically become colonizers of saying, if only they were as smart as us, they'd realize their experiences were silly. They banged their head or something.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's where the political stance of the postmodernist turn being a sort of left-wing objective really rubs me the wrong way, because it's not. Because I think it's actually more elitist than trying to find common ground about human beliefs and culture and experiences.
But I guess the big danger there is as well it's elitist, but because of its own mechanizations, it then won't allow for an objective value to come up to measure it against. So they're saying like, you're wrong, but also we have nothing to sort of come in to say why you're wrong, right? It's like, you're wrong, but don't but there's nothing to anchor that value judgment to. Yeah,
and there's an interesting parallel with the way science interacts with parapsychology. It's a similar parallel notion. Like, so for example, there's recently been this kind of thing on Facebook with Rupert Sheldrake. You're probably familiar with him. He's a Cambridge biologist who was sort of shut out of the academy once he came up with his ideas about morphic resonance and things that seemed too supernatural or paranormal for other biologists to accept. So he's been trying to challenge Steven Pinker to a debate about telepathy, and Pinker responded something like, I won't have this debate because telepathy doesn't exist. Telepathy is impossible, therefore it doesn't exist, therefore there's nothing to debate. I mean, that's not exactly what he said, but that's the gist of it. So it's a very similar kind of thing. I mean, the religious studies people aren't overtly making those kinds of scientific judgments, but ultimately that is what they're doing.
So what do you think it actually is that they're studying at the point that they've made all these judgments?
You mean the study of religions people?
Well, in terms of what you're studying, there's the way that you study it, but the way that it's quite damaging, the way they study it. I mean, what are they actually studying once they've made all these judgments, and then they say, right, now we can study it with our presumptions? I mean, what is that thing that's sort of left?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, maybe part of the problem or the issue is how particularized so many scholars are because of the way comparative studies have been thrown out. So, there are people who are just really, really hyper-focused on, I don't know, medieval nuns in Ireland or whatever it is, and that's their entire career. I mean, I guess I could say the same thing about me. My entire career has been in the afterlife, but across cultures and throughout history. So I'm kind of, it's a sort of different thing. But so maybe it's partly the narrow focus, but it's also, again, it's employment related. So it's recapitulated with each generation of new doctoral students. And I don't know how many times I've seen, PhDs that are basically some variation or another on, the deconstruction of religious experience, or the incomparability of religions or whatever it is. It's just basically they're towing the line, and they probably believe they're going to get a job, a full-time university post, and they might be right. I didn't, and I think there's a good reason why. But I think if you toe the line and if you repeat this stuff and you do it well, then you're more likely to be embraced into the community.
Which is sort of itself its own feedback loop, because then everyone
exactly
the fashion of the academy keeps bolstering itself until eventually you only get grants for doing the stuff which they're already talking about, and on and on and on, and then no one ever gets to write books about thinkers that are forgotten or things that are forgotten. Yeah,
and you get the same articles in the same books in the journals, and over and over and over. Essentially, I mean, there'll be a new spin here and there, but yeah, and it's getting worse too, because with the cuts in funding for the humanities in general, you have to now demonstrate impact on the real world, which it's difficult to do with a lot of these kinds of subjects. It's not enough that it's just looking at the ultimate nature of consciousness, or just little things like life after death or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's it's really sad. I mean, in terms of that, because of the funding cuts as well, it just means that the grant applications, it's really like, well, you only are going to apply for a grant that you're probably going to get, which means you'll do it on something that they're historically open to giving a grant for, and you just end up in this tighter and tighter channel, and I don't know where it's really going to end. But equally, this, I guess in a way, the sadder thing is that I genuinely don't think there's any agenda behind it, and all the academics I've spoken to, all from all political camps, all studies, whether it's anthropology, sociology, philosophy, psychology, all feel the same way. So it's almost this question of where is this strange agreement coming from? Who knows?
I know. I mean, I guess so much of it is just money, financial stuff. But.
Yeah. So your new book called The New World, I mean, in what sense does this differ from your previous two books?
The Next World, yeah.
Next World, sorry.
That's right. Well, the first one was, very focused comparison on civilizations in those 5 world regions, which was Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, India, and Mesoamerica. And then the second book was looking at indigenous religions and their responses to near-death experiences. So it was a little different because I had actual accounts of NDEs from explorers and missionaries and anthropologists around the world. So I was able to actually, validate some of the ideas that I had in the first book. So, for example, I had 30-something accounts from Native American texts saying this person died and went to the afterlife and came back, and that's how we know about the afterlife. So just validation that these experiences are generating religious beliefs. So the new book partly deals with revelations in near-death experiences, and part of the whole thrust of the book really is, given all the differences and problems and uncertainties and mysteries about near-death experiences, alongside the stuff that seems evidential, what kind of afterlife could there possibly be? What is a sort of reasonable example? So first I look at revelations in NDEs, and there's some an interesting case from the 80s where Kenneth Ring, who's an American NDE scholar, sort of one of the biggest and best, and then there was a British one, Margot Gray. They both found independently that there were a lot of predictions that people got during their NDEs, and independently they compared them and found that they were saying things like there's going to be a global catastrophe, and there's going to be all this suffering. It was usually an environmental thing. And then this is going to be followed by a golden age. This is going to happen sometime in the late 80s. And the most specific date given was 1988. Mm-hmm. And there was no connection. What's so interesting, there's no connection between either of these studies. Obviously, the predictions didn't come true. These were not, real divine revelations, unless the divinity is having a laugh or something. The question is, if NDEs are genuine experience of the afterlife, why are people coming back with false revelations? Why 1988? What's going on? So to look at that in a cultural way is I think the best explanation, which Kenneth Ring did. And it also parallels some of the stuff I found with Native American religions, that often in times of crisis and social upheaval, when people feel like there's a threat to their culture, NDEs are interpreted in this sort of, how should I put it, they're given a sense of cultural rebirth, which parallels the theme of an NDE, which is individual rebirth. So the person will come back and preach a rebirth of the culture, which is what they're doing with these apocalyptic prophecies. But they're saying it's going to happen after the death of the culture. It's then going to be resurrected in this new divine state, just as a near-death experiencer is, because they temporarily die and come back and they're spiritually transformed. So anyway, that was just sort of one example of the kinds of stuff I'm looking at. I then I review the first book, and I talk a little bit about the cases from the Pacific as examples of cross-cultural differences balanced with similarities. So, for example, in Polynesia and Melanesia, there were quite a lot of near-death experiences, and a lot of examples where people said they got their afterlife beliefs from near-death experiences. But in Australia and Micronesia, hardly any near-death experiences, very few myths that seemed like near-death experiences. And so those were areas where NDEs did not impact their religions as much. So I kind of took apart reasons why that might be. It was partly attitudes towards death, towards fear surrounding dead people coming back to life, so they wouldn't be given a chance to relate any NDE that they might have had, or shamanic practices that would kind of supersede NDEs in a way that made NDEs unnecessary. And I think in Australia, for example, if somebody had an NDE, it seems they were, by virtue of that experience, considered a shaman. So the NDE would be, related in shamanic sort of context. So that was, again, it's sort of a case study to look at ways in which similarities and differences across cultures can impact how NDEs are integrated into beliefs or rejected, or even integrated in beliefs in negative ways, or bolstering beliefs that somebody who comes back from the dead is a threat, essentially. And then I look at the mediumship stuff, as I mentioned earlier, to try to figure out why these mediumship accounts bear some similarities to NDEs, but then they're also so culturally situated. And I did the same thing in another chapter with intermission memories, which they're called, from accounts of children who remember past lives, supposedly. And in those accounts, the ones that I looked at, first of all, I should say there are probably hundreds of accounts of children who claim to remember past lives. They're researched by Ian Stevenson at University of Virginia, and now by Jim Tucker at University of Virginia. And there's multiple volumes and articles that detail the evidence for these cases, for and against, and there's some pretty interesting, compelling stuff in them. But I only looked at the ones that included examples of where the child remembered having died in their previous personality. And
so you're in like a sort of a third layer. So it's the death within a previous. So it's a near-death experience in a previous life.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Wow.
So they remember the NDE of their previous personality into their current life. So and that was really interesting, because more than the mediumship stuff, those corresponded to what we actually know about NDEs. And all of these cases are, unlike the mediumship stuff, again, they're much more compelling when it comes to the evidence and the research for each of the cases. So again, it was trying to explain why that similarity is there. And then I also looked at past life regression cases for which the evidence is extremely poor, in contrast to the spontaneous cases of children remembering past lives. And the interesting thing there is that those regression cases were much more similar to the mediumship cases. A lot more elaboration, a lot more very obviously, cultural wish fulfillment kind of stuff. And for me, it's like the more detail, the more elaboration, the longer it is, the more it stretches my imagination, and I reach my boggle threshold. Whereas with the intermission memories that correspond to NDEs, they're short enough and clear enough and specific enough and similar enough to NDEs that you start thinking, that's a little more compelling. So yeah, then the sort of culmination of all this was, given all this differences and all these similarities, what kind of afterlife could there possibly be? How can we explain the similarities between something as, poorly evidentially accounted for, like past life regression and NDEs? That's a little trickier question to me. I don't know if that's if they are genuinely having some intimations of the afterlife, if the medium is having like a short, almost shamanic type trance state, or if they really are getting messages from the dead or whatever. But yeah, then it seemed that, so the conclusion is really exploring this idea of either our consciousness is projecting imagery onto some objective afterlife, or we're co-creating it with the souls of other people.
Well, I mean, I sort of feel like I have to ask, Gregory. I mean, given all your research and everything of your contemporary research with the next world, I mean, where do we go when we die? What's your best what's your best approximation? Sometimes I think that, given the reincarnation stuff and given all the different afterlife beliefs, I almost wonder if we're all going to go to possibly different places, and different things are going to happen, partly depending on what we believe, partly depending on maybe how we died. A lot of the reincarnation cases were sudden death, unexpected accidents or something. So I don't know. It might be some are reincarnated, some have a very typical NDE-like experience. There are negative NDEs as well, so maybe depending on the state of your consciousness, your psychology, if you have a lot of guilt or shame, or you've done some terrible things, maybe you will have some kind of, being dragged down to hell by demons. I don't know. Wow. But I do think that because of NDEs, there's enough similarity there that we're probably going to believe that we're having this amazing, glorious transitional experience into the next world. But nobody knows what happens after that. So I see what you mean. So that transition experience, as you were talking before about two people looking at the same thing, and it's for one, it's, I don't know, Japanese temple, and to the other, it's an English cricket green or something.
Right.
Is the same transitional experience possibly from death to birth, in that just that idealism is transformed in some sense.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Wow. And it could also be that once those images play out, then we snuff out and we're dead. It might be that the NDE is just like the sort of final burst of consciousness. It's released and then you're gone. But that's in contrast to what people who have NDEs actually tell us. So I always like to go back to respecting the sources of our information.
My favorite theory on all of these was always Peter Uspensky's, which was that you have to, along with Gurdjieff, you have to earn your soul. But unlike Gurdjieff, who said you only have one chance to do this, he said you have a few, but he never said how many. So you get to go round and round again. But if you don't make enough effort with the chances that you have, then you just die. Which I always thought was very very bleak, very Russian.
Yeah, that's true. And there's also this distinction between types of reincarnation. So, for example, this in a lot of the past life regression accounts, there's this very morally problematic thing where you choose your own rebirth because you have some lesson to learn. So, and there's even these accounts of people saying they were allowed to test drive their new body and see what it was like to be the new person, which is, I don't even see how that's possible if that even conceptually rational, because that new person you're going to be born into presumably isn't alive yet. So how could you go test drive their body? But even beyond that, just the idea of, this isn't a Buddhist or Indian thing of choosing your own body because you need to learn a lesson. And it's also, reincarnation isn't a positive thing in Eastern religions, whereas in the West, it seems to be seen as positive. And then this notion that it's not, karma that's dictating the nature of your next life or your rebirth. It's your own choice to teach yourself a lesson. And some of the descriptions are really appalling. So, for example, one of them said this person needed to, learn what it was like to be vulnerable and in a horrible situation. I can't remember the reasoning for it, but essentially they deliberately entered into a body which they knew would be a rape victim in the next life because they had to learn. So it's just this, and it's all presented in this sort of new age glorious thing, like, oh, we get to choose and we have
that's what I was going to say. That's very much a Western approach to that of choice, right? That you go to a shopping mall of reincarnation bodies.
Yes,
it seems it seems a bit like, even if you get to pick, I mean, you still get the choice, which seems very against consciousness in a way. Like, I don't know.
Consumerist reincarnation.
Yeah,
you can shop for your new body online. But yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that there's an objectively moral ground to the universe or anything, but I'm also thinking that if there is, it's probably not going to be something like that. Because that just leads anybody to say, well, I'm just working out my karmic script in my life, and that's why I'm a serial killer. That's why I've whatever. So,
it becomes a bit determinist then.
Yeah.
Have you yourself ever had any experience of these sorts?
No. I've had pointless little sort of supposedly psychic experiences, but nothing like an NDE. I mean, just a ridiculous example is I can't even remember her name. She was the star of The Creature from the Black Lagoon from the 50s. and Julie Adams, maybe. And I had a dream about her floating above me, and she said something I can't remember now. And then and I probably hadn't thought about her in decades since I had seen the movie. And the next morning, I scrolling through news, and she had died that night. So, I mean, that's just an inexplicably, pointlessly weird thing. And I don't have any connection with her.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you know her?
No.
Because that tends to happen with people you know. I think that happened to Rudolf Steiner before his auntie died. He saw, or like they didn't know she died, and then he saw her walk across a train station when he was very young, and then it turns out the next day that she died. And that's generally like I think, well, he read that as that was her saying to him, I've become your guardian angel. So I'm going to say, Gregory, that your guardian angel is Julie Andrews from the Black Lagoon, apparently.
Yeah, maybe so.
Wow,
she's not doing a great job so far, though.
Wow, that's a peculiar one. That is a peculiar one.
I did have a Ouija board experience that was interesting too, though.
Yeah.
I was doing it a few years ago on New Year's Eve, so it was really late. And it was with somebody who had never done it before, who didn't quite get it. He was a native Russian speaker, and kind of very tired, and a couple drinks, and not really into it. And I was saying, "Come on, let's try it again." And it kept spelling the same thing over and over. And I kept trying to puzzle it out, and it's like looked like nonsense, and it looked like TOBO something. I'm like, oh, what the hell? And it kept spelling it. And then it kept saying, read it again, over and over. Finally, I twigged, and I saw to be or not to be, which is really interesting because of the fact that I didn't get it for so long, and because I'm 99% positive that the person with me was, not really that engaged and couldn't have been moving it. So that was interesting. And then even then it said read it again, and spelled out OBE, which is short for out of body experience, which is the last three letters of to be or not to be. So that was a little weird as well.
It's also, is it Order of the British Empire as well? So
that's right. Yeah, it could have been.
I mean, I like the idea though of some sort of spirit or angel getting frustrated, like they're giving you a sign and then they're saying like, I can't do any more than this. Can you just read?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that made me think, okay, there's something going on here. And I was like, okay, can I go to bed now? It's like, read it again. But still, there's always part of me that who knows what part of the subconscious I was tapping into, to the point where I didn't even know what I was spelling and wasn't aware that my hands were moving. So.
Wow. So, whereabouts can we find when's your latest, The Next World release?
Should be within the next few weeks. That's published with White Crow Books. They're in Guildford, and they sort of specialize in this kind of thing, afterlife, paranormal stuff. So it can be found on White Crow website. It'll also be on Amazon and Waterstones and Barnes and Noble and everything.
This chat probably won't go live for a few weeks, so I'll make sure when I produce it to search, and if it's live, I'll put the links in the description below. And you also do a lot of patron stuff as well, don't you? Patreon.
Yeah, I have a Patreon account, which is Patreon.com/Gregory Shushan. I have a website too, GregoryShushan.com. So I've also I contributed to a new book by a guy named DJ Kadagian, and it's called The Crossover Experience. And I contributed some stuff along with Pim Van Lommel, who's a scientific NDE researcher. So that's out now. That just came out, and that should be an interesting book. He's not a scholar, but he's gone through and found lots and lots of NDEs and sort of put together composites of what an NDE might be like. He's kind of looked at them thematically, and then Pim Van Lommel and I have gone through and made our comments and criticisms, in my case at least, on some of the accounts and sort of my perspectives from a historian of these kinds of experiences.
Wow. Whereabouts can that book be found?
That's either on his website, crossoverexperience.com, I think, but it's also on Amazon. Cool. And hopefully that's going to be a documentary before too long. The book is sort of a springboard aiming in that direction.
Okay. Is that, are you sort of in the funding stage?
That's basically DJ's job. I'm going to be a talking head. So at least so far, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Unless there's anything you'd like to add that you feel we've missed.
I think that covers it. It's interesting talking as we kind of approached it from the opposite end that normally goes, but that's good.
Okay. Well, Gregory Shushan, thanks very much.
Great. Thanks a lot.